So, welcome to another episode of the ENYTING Gender podcast. I'm your host, Shaman Prince, and with me today I have Elsa Carmen Saliba. And Elsa is a political science student and paralegal who, since her early years, has dedicated her life and time to fight injustice in the Middle East, and especially in Lebanon. She's a certified paralegal and educator in the matters of gender-based violence and domestic abuse, a volunteer with several NGOs that deal with women and children's rights, a research assistant in several studies led by professors and their peers revolving around gender issues. Welcome, Elsa. Is there anything that you would like to add to your bio?
Well, honestly, I think that sums it up pretty well. And just it's a bit of an additional information on myself because it's also something that I'm pretty involved in. I'm a national team rugby player, so I'm pretty involved when it comes to the relationship between sports and politics in Lebanon, especially. So how these two things work together.
I was pretty intrigued when I saw that you're a rugby player. I am so familiar with rugby because I'm from Guyana in South America. So when I saw that, I'm like, okay, Elsa is tough because rugby is a very physical sport. So congratulations on that, and thank
Thank you
you
so much.
for asking. So let's just dive um into what we're going to discuss. In your view,
Mhm.
what are the historical and the cultural factors that has led to the weaponization of women's abuse in Lebanon?
Well, that's a pretty heavy question, and it goes back to the roots of the culture, Arab culture in general, not just specifically Lebanese one. And so basically, there's always this dichotomy for women. So first off, there's the side of being a conservative homemaker, having children, building a home, being there for your husband. And then there's the completely opposite side, which is having this sexual essence, the sensual energy to you that is also there in order to satisfy the men in the community. And so when it comes to weaponizing femininity inside of Lebanon and the Arab world as a whole, it is shaming a woman who fits into one of these two poles for not having enough of the other's energy, whereas she might fit on somewhere along that spectrum, but does not fulfill the two images perfectly, which no one does at the end of the day. You cannot be a prude and then at the same time have the skills of, for example, let's say the biggest porn star on earth. It just does not fit together. And so when it comes to the Arab world, and especially Lebanon, where I come from, you get the opening to Western culture, to movies, to having access to everything, but then still holding on to the traditional Arab norms, especially by men and some women in the communities, of course. And so that sort of duality then falls onto the woman's back because she has to find that middle ground to find herself in her society while still being able to be herself.
And how does one cope with that duality? Is there supportive systems and community organizations that helps women with the confusion? Because if you're looking for acceptance, there will be confusion if you cannot fulfill one and you're fulfilling the other.
Well, there definitely is a communal sense found in Lebanon. So whether you're talking from cities to the most remote villages, there's always going to be that communal sense, especially in womanhood. While there is always going to be that taboo of, oh, you can't talk about that, this is something that's super private, there's always going to be that one woman in the village, for example, that's there to help the other younger women. So she's usually someone who's elder. And then when it comes to more city-based things, we have a lot of non-governmental organizations. So we have a lot of NGOs that are put in place, whether they are purely Lebanese or between Lebanon and France, Lebanon and the US, Lebanon and the UK. So there's always going to be NGOs who are put in place in order to help women who are survivors of domestic abuse, sexual assault, who just do not fit in their environment. And so they help them relocate. And then they offer education, they offer courses in order to help them find themselves in that chaotic environment that they are in.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that question so eloquently. How do the current legal frameworks in Lebanon address or fail to address the issues of women's abuse?
Well, there's definitely a failure there. We still live in a nation, for example, this is, I think, it's the most primitive thing that is lacking in the Lebanese system, is that a woman is not allowed to give her nationality to her children. So if I am a woman and I get pregnant, I may not give my children my nationality unless they are put under a man's name. So there needs to be a father or a father figure on the birth certificate, or else they are left paperless. Now, that is extremely controversial when it comes to Lebanon, because we are considered to be one of the more advanced and open-minded nations. And then you see laws such as that not being altered because of demographic reasons, as lawmakers put it. And then when it comes to the punishment of women's abuse, rape has been criminalized, but the sentencing is still very much not equal to what happens. So, for example, if someone is sexually assaulted but is not raped per se, so if there is not penetration, as is said in Lebanese law, the man may be subject to 1 or 2 years in jail, and that's if he is sentenced. And then the procedure of a woman going to put her to actually go and report and then go through all of that is absolutely horrendous. She is shamed. She's not victimized. She's just vilified. She is used as the main motive. So everything points towards the survivor of the action in order to sort of relieve the perpetrator from their offense. And then another law which is present is, let's say if I am personally raped and I marry my rapist, then that is not rape anymore, because marital rape is not recognized by Lebanese law at any point. So these sort of contingencies in the law actually prevent women from reporting sorts of assault or going towards legal and proper, more, how do I say this? So they refrain from going to the police, and then they resort to going to NGOs, for example, or going to independent lawyers in order to get themselves the help that they should be getting.
And I think that's common throughout the world, because of the stigmatization, because of the re-victimization and being re-traumatized over and over. Most rape victims would not report it. Can you explain the concept of femininity being vilified and fetishized?
Yes. So I find that this is present throughout the world. So a lot of feminine aspects, especially I find feminine and childish aspects, even when we look at certain cultures, the showing of certain childish-like aspects of young girls are even sexualized. But when it comes to the Arab world specifically, because I feel like this is more where I can speak of it, I find that we take a lot from Western media. And so it is very well present that the Arab woman is notably represented as being the hijabi woman. She has her hijab, she's pretty conservative. She is living that life of being under pressure. She's not happy with her living conditions. All she wants to do is getting out of her country, out of her household. She wants to go take her hijab off, live that promiscuous life. And so I feel like that sort of imagery has integrated into Lebanese and Arab culture and mannerisms and talking and mainstream media. And so now what we see is women either holding on to that traditional woman image, so not doing anything, and then poof, you see her at 30, she just goes out and is trying to live again her life and reclaim her teenage years and her early age because that was taken away from her. She was not given the opportunity to live her age. Or you see the very young girl who lives to be that very desirable woman, although she is in her very early teenage years. And then you see that both of these women are then survivors or victims, depending on the consequences, of assault, of battery, of all of those kinds of things, both because they're trying to fit again into that sort of spectrum that I mentioned earlier. And so I feel like the vilification of that femininity, both the aspects of femininity that are found prominently in the Arab culture and Lebanese culture, it's spreading more and more every day. And now with what is happening in Palestine, for example, Arab women and young girls and Palestinian girls are not treated as human. They are seen as numbers on a screen. So, for example, an article I read was of an 8-year-old young girl who was massacred in her home. And the article actually read the title, Young Palestinian Woman, when this is an 8-year-old child that was being talked about. So that sort of complete dystopian view of another human being just because they are seen as less than due to a race or religion by Western media predominantly is absolutely mind-boggling to me, because that would never have taken place had the young girl been white or European or American or anything else, or just not Muslim. So they're just seen as numbers.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm listening to you. What feelings did it erupt when you read that article of an 8-year-old child being labeled as a young woman? What feelings did that elicit?
It's not even something that you can express honestly. So within my work as a paralegal, I do work with people coming in from Palestine, and we then help them locate legal aid or housing or people who can take them in at least for a short while so they can get some footing. But aside from that, seeing any young girl who's 8, not just a Palestinian one, but any young girl referred to as a young woman is absolutely disgusting because, first off, it's infuriating because when I find that it is a journalist's duty to cover something as properly and as clearly as possible. And that article title was absolutely misleading. And I can assure you that everyone who saw that the headline was not as affected as they would have been had they read that it was an 8-year-old young girl who was massacred inside of her own home, right in front of her parents. These words and the way that it is portrayed and brought onto the audience makes a huge difference. So for me, it is absolutely mind-boggling and infuriating to see such language being used to refer to a young girl.
Thank you. And my next question is on the media in Lebanon. How has the media contributed to the of women in Lebanon being vilified and their roles in their feminine roles portrayed?
So here there is a huge gap, I would say. You've got the media that is followed by the youth predominantly, which is actually all for feminism, the rise of women in society, us actually going for what we want and getting what we want, and intersectionality and proper equality. And then you get the absolute opposite, which is more traditional forms of media that is followed predominantly by the adults, by the older people in the community. And then you see that these people still, for example, they still talk about certain instances with government officials that have made sexist comments, or and it's talked about for weeks and weeks on end. And so you see this huge gap between the newer generation that is actually looking up to the media that is showing equality, and then the older generation, which is also raising the new generation, which raises a lot of questions. And so you see that older generation, which is still holding on to these stereotypes and harmful statements regarding women.
Do you see in the near future the possibility of bridging the gap that exists between the young generation and the older generation?
I hope so. In my experience, it is possible. And I'm saying in my experience because it branches from my own home life, where I've seen my parents actually progress in their thoughts, especially my father. And then throughout my work, throughout my university experience and my school experience and extracurriculars, I have seen how people have been able to sort of decorticate their thoughts in order to question their morals. But then on the other hand, that takes effort and it takes will. So it's all going to depend on whether that older generation is going to want to listen and change their old ways and see how these thoughts actually were detrimental to their generations and the way that the generation as a whole has been treated and has progressed. And then for them to actually want to make the research, want to have the conversations, want to make the change.
What are some of the factors that you think helped your father to change his perspective?
Well, first off, my parents are divorced. And so after the divorce, me and my brother stayed with my dad, although we were still seeing my mother constantly. But it was mainly with him because his house was closer to our school. So it got to a point where me and my dad were clashing constantly. It was just two big heads just butting at home. And then I think he realized that to a certain point, if he did not change, he would lose me. Because it's easy to have your child when they're still young and fully dependent on you for everything in their life. But then had I become an adult and still had that relationship with him, that dynamic of him just headbutting with me, not accepting me as my own person, I would have still loved him, I'm sure, but it would not have had that dynamic of that kind of friendship between us. And so, of course, it starts with baby steps. So I started doing the little teenage rebel thing. I started getting my ears pierced, got my first tattoo, started. So it was these things. And then eventually it got on to heavier topics, which turns out he could accept because he wanted to accept me. So it was more of an emotional change for him.
Let's speak to the Lebanese parents who might be listening and they're having conflict with their girl child. What would you say to them?
Well, first off, I get how difficult it can be to see your child, who I'm sure everyone has this image of their child, that the perfect kid they want, who they want to raise, yada yada yada. But at the same time, I feel like it's so much more beautiful to see your child flourishing into their own person. And so actually a Lebanese writer who every single Lebanese parent I know loves, Gibran Khalil Gibran, actually said, أولادكم ليسوا لكم, your children aren't yours. So it is your role as a parent to raise them, to give them all the tools in order to make it in this life. But at the end of the day, it's so much more beautiful to actually have a relationship with them than to alienate them because of certain ideologies that you cannot get out of your mind. So my advice would be make an effort to grow out of that outdated mentality and try understanding your child, try finding that middle ground because it makes such a difference.
What would you say to the child or the adolescent, the young adult?
Well, I'd say just take it easy because that's something I had to learn. It's that although for us it is very easy to think, oh, they're outdated, they're just old, they're not going to change. Sometimes the parents are making an effort. It just takes them a bit of time. So my advice would just be take it easy, see the baby steps for the steps that they are, and just be happy that an effort is being made.
What motivated you to become an activist?
Honestly, I think it was my early exposure to news. So I was very young when I started reading news, when I started staying up to date with what was happening around the world. And then as I was reading, all I could think of was this is just not fair. And so it was actually my parents who encouraged me to read up on what's happening, to stay up to date, to learn certain human rights, to learn what the meaning of human rights is, why there is that sort of, for example, why there is racism in the world, why colorism exists, why Arab people are seen for the way that they are seen, what different types of discrimination exists in the world. And so because of that very young exposure I had, I was able to start from a very young age. And it was honestly one of my best friends when he came out to me as being queer. And when I saw the difference between my reaction to him coming out and other people's reaction, I did not like that. And so I decided that it would be my life's mission to fight for minority rights.
You have some background noise, but I think my software, when I edit, may take it out. Hopefully, I hope so. What role do local communities and activists like yourself play in combating the weaponization of women abuse?
Well, since we live in Lebanon, which is, as I have mentioned, one of the more open countries to Western culture, at the same time, we do still have that Arab mentality very much present within the men in that society. Of course, women still have it, but that goes back to patriarchal systems, and that's a whole other discussion. But the role that local activists and local organizations play is that I'm not even going to say we, because I, as a person, play such a small part on the scene as a whole. But all of these outlets provide a safe space for women to actually go and seek refuge and seek help. And when these women seek that refuge, they are in a way reclaiming their position in society, because getting out of a mentality of I can't help myself, I cannot find help, is already a step forward into progressing as a society. And then when these women in turn raise their children, are present in their environments, then that is automatically going to change the outlook of their friends, let's say, or it's going to spark up a discussion between them and their brother, them and their father, them and their son, which in turn is definitely going to, even if it's going to be slow, it's going to affect that mentality and change it over and over decades and decades.
Thank you for that. Can you share examples of effective grassroots campaigns and initiatives that address the issues of the weaponization of women's abuse?
So a campaign that I actually love to talk about is one that was made surrounding periods. And it started off very nicely as a social experiment where a woman went out in white pants and had a blood stain, which was obviously done with ink. And then it was there to find people's reactions. So she was sent to public places, and then you could see how different people reacted to seeing her. Some people laughed, some people directly went up to her, put their jackets on her waist, covered her up, let her know. Some girls let her borrow pads, tampons. So there was always, that was the first part of it. And then that progressed into raising funds for sanitary products for women who cannot have access to them as easily. Another ad is around sexual assault and rape in Lebanon. And it was in Arabic. It was هيدا مش عيب ولا عار. And so what it basically means is that rape is not something to be ashamed of. It is not something that stains your name. It is not something that you are to be scared of, or it's not going to ruin your family's name, because the family honor is a big thing in Lebanon. But it should be reported, it should be talked about. So it was a very well-funded campaign, a lot of exposure to it. And within that campaign, there was the training of over 2,000 members of internal forces in Lebanon on how to respond to rape and sexual assault victims. So I find it to be successful because through that campaign, we were able to educate the men who used to once be the biggest part of scarediness, for the women. And now they are better trained in order to respond and what to ask and what not to ask. So that was very successful.
I like that you mentioned the involvement of men. Is there a strong male allyship for women who are abused and in women inequality space?
That is a tricky question because the answer is yes and no. So I'm saying that because first off, as I have said, there's a big communal feeling in Lebanon. So the men of one community are not going to stand by as a woman in their community is facing abuse, is facing injustice. At the same time, these men are not going to speak out if they know that one of their male friends is inflicting that onto women in most cases. But we go back to that, the fact that the younger generation is being more open to all of the advancements and the Western idea of women's rights and women being seen as equal. So there is a growing number of men who are actually taking an active stance in order to help women in their fight of such things.
Thank you. Can we talk a little about policy and reform if that's possible from a policy perspective? What changes are necessary to combat the weaponization of women's abuse in Lebanon? Your background noise is becoming very loud. It's getting louder.
Yes, excuse me. I will try to move actually. So, because I'm still at university, so I'm gonna try to go to another room. It's okay. Hi, Sana. Excuse me, is this better?
Yes.
Yes, so in terms of policy making, it is actually a very multi-layered question because I personally find that to make changes in terms of policies, changes in terms of culture and education are needed. So I personally find that every change starts at school level. So once the younger generation is properly educated, that is directly going to reflect on them when they grow up, and then eventually it's going to change the culture gradually. So for me, I find that the policies have to firstly focus on integrating proper education in terms of inequality within school curriculums, which is pretty tricky because in Lebanon there are definitely several forms of culture due to different communities being present in the country. So that is going to be tricky because we don't even have a unified history in the nation. So agreeing on the concept of social equality is something very far-fetched, I feel, for policymakers. And then on the other hand, if we want to work on something that's very short-term and that is going to act fast, it definitely, in my opinion, is going to be properly sanctioning people who commit these acts. So recognizing marital rape, it is unacceptable that we are living in 2024 and a woman being raped by her husband cannot report it because he is her husband. Recognizing the fact that flashing on the street, that sexual assault such as groping, such as catcalling, such as just anything that does not necessarily entail penetration is sexual assault. So in my opinion, these policies, if put in place with proper sanctioning to the perpetrators, will make a difference, even if not necessarily by mentality, but by habit. Because sometimes you kind of have to force something down someone's throat. So if people are forced to abide by these rules, then eventually it's going to change their mentalities.
Thank you. Are there NGOs or even government agencies that are advocating for these changes?
Definitely. So starting with one of the NGOs who I work with predominantly, Justice Without Frontiers, we mainly focus on working with survivors of domestic abuse and gender-based violence, as well as individuals without papers, so people who are born and are paperless. So we are advocating, there is an NGO called CAFA, there is MERSA, there are certain members of parliament who are actively fighting and seeking for people to have access to such rules. And so the thing is, in Lebanon, we are going through a very stressful period at the moment. There is the economic crisis, there is Palestine, right at, like the Palestinian-Israeli war right at our footsteps. We as a nation are getting bombarded almost every day. People's minds are not exactly there. So people's focus is actually in a different area. So whenever that is brought up, the main response is, oh, why are you even thinking about this? Think of how we're going to fix the economy, or think of how we're going to fix the borders, or how we're going to fix the demography. So women's rights are at the back of people's minds.
You mentioned the paperless child, how a child becomes paperless, and you just mentioned it again. And I want us to revisit that. And I'm going to repeat what I think I heard. When a woman, let's say a single parent, I'm from a single parent home, so my mother gave birth to me. My father was not there to sign. I am paperless.
Yes. So a Lebanese woman cannot give her citizenship or her passport to her child. And the reasoning that we are given for that is for demographic reasons, because apparently lawmakers do not want Lebanese women to have children with Syrian or Palestinian men. and for that demographic change to occur, which is absolutely senseless. But that is the reasoning that is given. And so let's say I am personally a woman who gets pregnant while being single. My brother, my father, my friend, my cousin, I need a man to sign on the birth certificate as the father of the child in order for that child to have the passport. Or else they are paperless and they remain paperless for the rest of their life, which in turn makes getting into a school impossible, getting into university, getting a proper job, having social security, traveling, getting married, all of these things become legally practically impossible, which in turn basically ruins someone's life. It sets someone up for failure because their mother was not able to give them her passport.
That's understood. Let's say you get pregnant for a Syrian man. Can he sign the birth certificate?
No, unless I want to give my child the Syrian passport then. But when it comes to the Lebanese passport, since the woman is not enough to give the child the Lebanese passport, if the Syrian man signs on the certificate, it's like extra stamp of failure for the child because, oh, you're born from a Lebanese woman and a Syrian man. Well, you're gonna have to struggle your whole life because you're seen as a refugee in the country. And then moreover, you're not gonna have any Lebanese papers. So you're gonna have to be a proper, just a full Syrian person within Lebanese grounds.
So this is more about national identity and citizenship and can I say ethnicity too?
Well, I'm going to give you my own personal opinion, and that goes back to the formation of current Lebanon, of what we know today as the modern Lebanon. So we were under French mandate, and then right before that, when France wanted to sort of divide the region, they took Beirut, Mount Lebanon, Tripoli, some regions in the south, and then they put it together like a puzzle, and they named it Lebanon. Not taking into consideration the fact that we have 18 communities living within 10,500 kilometers. And these 18 communities each have their own culture, their own norms. Of course, there are certain things that tie us together as a Lebanese people, such as culture, foods, language, borders, law, yada, yada, yada. But at the end of the day, the Christian community is going to want to fight for the Christian community's presence. The Muslim community, same here. The Druze community, same here. So the fact that there are 18 different sects and communities living within these grounds, this territory, makes it so hard to pinpoint whether or not there's a national feeling or an ethnicity, if you will, because that national feeling is so divided that one would have to properly determine where it starts and where it ends. Because in my opinion, we have communal feelings. We don't have a national feeling. And the people who do have a national feeling are very few in comparison to the ones that don't. So you've got, for example, a Christian coming from Mount Lebanon who is extremely attached to Mount Lebanon, but does not see the far north and the far south as parts of Lebanon. And then you've got the person from the south who sees the south as his world, but then does not see the rest of the world. You've got the Beiruti, you've got the person from Kisirwan. So all of these areas are divided. Even if we're joined in the same country, everyone is divided, and that is because of very poor choices from the French government when it came to dividing the region and deciding who would have control of what. So here we go back to the effects of colonialism on current societies and the way that we are having to deal with it now.
Thank you. Thank you for providing that historical background and cultural background. Have you met women who are paperless and have paperless children? How are they coping, and how do they manage?
Well, unfortunately, I have. And it's very sad to see the way that they have to live. So I've had the chance, actually, I say, to work with women who are paperless and have paperless children, women who are paperless but have children with papers, women who have papers and have paperless children. So I've been able to sort of be on every part of that spectrum. And the very, very sad thing is that a lot of these children do not know that they are paperless until they are looking for a job or until they are wanting to enroll in university, because most of the time they're enrolled in public school anyway. And then when it comes to going into public university, boom, you don't have your paper, get out. Or you want a proper job, where's your birth certificate? Oh, I don't have it. You have to work unlawful jobs, or you have to work check by check or day by day because your company cannot insure you. You cannot have social security. And so seeing these people actually having to suffer the consequences of an unjust system every single day of their lives is heartbreaking, because all they want to do is just have an equal chance at life, at a lack of a better way of saying it. All they want is to be able to be seen as active members of society, which they are most of the time. But due to their status as a paperless person, they cannot be recognized, and they are not recognized by most of society, but they are just seen as, they're just paperless. They're seen as the garbage of society, and they're just not even thought about when making policies because they're not citizens anyway.
I'm listening to you, and I can only imagine the psychological fortitude it takes for a Lebanese woman who was born and raised in Lebanon, but because of whatever circumstances, she has a paperless child. I'm hearing it, I understand it, but it is so difficult to accept that, because I've worked with we call them undocumented persons here in the US, but they're undocumented because they came to the country illegally, right?
Yes.
That's not the case with the women in Lebanon. They were born there. Their roots are there. They might be, all of their generations are Lebanese, but they have undocumented children because of a patriarchal system and law that forces a woman to have a man to sign for that child. Wow.
100%. And the thing is, in Lebanon, abortion is illegal and it is actually criminalized. So you obviously have the sketchy underground abortions that take place, or what I call the DIY abortions, where it's the very cliche, the hanker that. But at the same time, sex as a whole is seen as a big taboo. So let's say I am a 20-year-old woman. I am not to be having any sexual relations, or at least any sexual relations that I am having are not to be discussed until I am a married woman or until I am in my marital bed, let's say. So although these practices are disappearing with the newer generation, we are speaking up, about sex, about what it's like having relationships, yada, yada, yada. It is still a big taboo among the older generation. And then when you come and look at the fact that abortion is criminalized and punishable, and that a woman not only has to go through gestation and through giving birth alone, she also has to live with the stress of knowing that she cannot give anything to her child because she has been let out of her house for being pregnant before getting married. She has ruined her family's honor. She has dirtied the family's name. All of that shows, and actually there are extremely elevated rates of postpartum depression and psychosis among Lebanese women and young Lebanese mothers because they most often are not given the support that they require by their system, by their society, and the people and organizations that do provide these services are often either booked over their heads if their services are free or affordable, or they are actually extremely pricey and expensive, and women cannot afford them.
Wow. Thank you so much, Elsa. In looking forward, what is your vision for the future of women's rights and gender equality in Lebanon?
Well, I have like a two-tier answer to that. First off, in order to be able to discuss women's rights in Lebanon, I feel like we have to discuss human rights as a whole, because then that is just one branch of human rights. And I feel like human rights in Lebanon as a whole are not properly given because of the economics and because, of the economy and the political state that we are in. A lot of people, regardless of their gender, do not have access to their basic rights. And then when we see the political climate of the region, especially looking at Palestine, since it is the most relevant topic at the moment in the region, then I honestly have no hope regarding the Western help that's going to come to Lebanon, because seeing how they're treating our brothers and sisters in Palestine, I cannot imagine what they would do had we been in that position. Because although we do have good ties and relations, and we have always had that energy and that relation to Western countries, I do believe that there is a certain level of performative activism when it comes to the support given to our communities. But then, on the other hand, as I am a very active member of the youth when it comes to activism, when it comes to working on the ground and seeing how things are evolving, I can't help but be hopeful, because I see how my peers are actually changing their vocabulary, they're changing their manner of tackling certain issues, they are changing their opinions, they are speaking up within their households, they are not allowing their women peers in university or school to sort of be overlooked. I can't help but be hopeful when I see that my brother at school, him and his other guy friends, are actually speaking up about the sexist dress code. They are not allowing any male professors to sort of make fun of the female students. When I see that the younger generation is speaking up, and as I've mentioned, that the older generation, that a chunk of them is making the effort to sort of meet us halfway, then I am definitely hopeful to the future of gender equality in Lebanon and eventually women's rights growing and hopefully flourishing.
Thank you. Thank you. How can listeners, both in Lebanon and globally, contribute to the support of the movement against the weaponization of women's abuse?
Yes. Talk. Just talk about it. Never stay silent, especially if you come from outside of Lebanon. What I would say is everyone in Lebanon, at least in their inner circles, are aware of the things that happen. We talk about it. We try fixing it. But at the end of the day, talking about it, especially from people abroad, is going to help put pressure on our lawmakers and on their lawmakers to then pressure our lawmakers. Because at the end of the day, it's the people it's the government represents the people and the parliament represents the people. So if that people is talking about issues and if they are in support of a cause and if they are donating to certain NGOs or individuals who are in need of that money, then it will automatically help us in making gender equality a proper reality in our nation. But if it stays something that is not spoken about and then there's barely any education, then how can we ever dream, not even wish, how can we ever dream of having these advancements?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elsa. In closing, is there anything you want to leave with us?
Well, to finish it off, I just want to say that Lebanon is a gorgeous country. We've got so much to offer, and it is actually so sad to see that me and my fellow women in the country are often mistreated just because of some genitals. It's okay, everyone's got genitals. So it's just very sad to see that mistreatment. And I really hope that we will have that sort of equality that we are longing for very soon, and that we will actually just pick up the fruits that we have been reaping for so long. And I just want to thank you and the listeners for having me.
Thank you so much.